Good morning. Here we are at Ada Hayden Park, north of Ames. We're going to be taking a look at mainly wetland areas and reconstructed prairie this morning. We're going to be looking at probably a mix of native and non-native. Again, the focus of this webinar is non-native species, but as we go along, we'll probably be putting out some native ones as well. The idea, of course, is for you to be able to distinguish between the native and non-native species. So we're in a little bit of a wetland basin here, reconstructed wetland basin. And we'll start right here along the edge. I'm going to take a look at some things that we see right here. One of the species that you're going to see often in a wetland, of course, are smartweeds. There's a couple of small plants right down through here. You really need to have, it really helps a lot to have the flowers and especially the tepals in order to do smartweeds. In order to key them out or to sort of separate them, there's a couple of things we always take a look at. One of them is the ochrea. The ochrea is a sheath of membranous tissue that begins at the attachment of the leaves and goes up the stem a short ways. We look at that ochrea and with special interest in taking a look at whether or not it's got bristles, any little bristles on the top edge of it. And I can see some little bristles on these ochrea here. That puts it into a group that the next time we want to take a look at are the flowers, the tepals, which is a term that's used to describe petals and sepals that look alike. And I can see that these have little punctate glandular dots. That pretty much tells me that it's one of two species. It's either dotted smartweed, Persicaria punctata, or is pepper smartweed, Persicaria hydropiper. And you can look at the achenes, which are the fruits that would be inside these flowers, except that they're not really developed yet. Or what I often do is just take a leaf, put it in my mouth, chew it a little bit. It takes about maybe 30 seconds or so. And I'm not getting any kind of hot, peppery sensation there. That suggests to me that this is Persicaria punctata, dotted smartweed, because hydropiper, like its name suggests, pepper smartweed, when you chew on the leaf for a little while, you will start to feel a very sort of hot, like a hot pepper type of sensation. So probably Polygonum punctatum. Now this is a native species. Hydropiper is a native species as well, but they look somewhat similar to two non-native species. Hopefully we'll see those. There's lady's thumb, Persicaria maculata, and there's another one, Persicaria longicida. Those two are non-native species that look somewhat similar to this, have sort of the same gestalt as this. They don't have those punctate glands though that we saw on the flowers. All right, that's the smartweed. Of course, another non-native one that we've already talked about, I think a few times, at least the first time out, and I think we probably saw some the second time too, is this plant, which you're always going to probably run across in a wetland basin or a wet soil place environment. Reed canary grass. Here again we see it with the flowers finishing up here. The leaves starting to dry up a little bit here. I mentioned this I think last time. You can usually depend on reed canary grass to have a fairly large ligule, this membranous structure right here. You can see that membrane sticking up there quite a ways. The collar area is the area between the sheath and the blade. That collar area is a really light green coloration right through there. Pretty broad leaves as far as grass leaves go. Reed canary grass, which again I think I've mentioned before, but just quick mentioning as well that this is a native species to North America, but the cultivars that are widespread and established throughout North America, and especially in Iowa, the cultivar is not native, of course, and that's the origin of the problems with it being an invasive species. Here's another weed. I think I mentioned this last time as well, but I pointed out this is giant ragweed, Ambrosia trifida. Pretty distinctive tri-lobed leaves here. This one can get really big. It's a really good example of an early successional ruderal or R-selected type of species. I've seen giant ragweed as tall as 10 to 12 feet tall in really rich soils. And up here we have a couple of willows. So we'll just mention those since we're looking at them here. This one looks like to me, when I take a look at the willows, and willows are challenging for sure. A couple of things we want to look at when we look at willows is, first of all, the coloration pattern on the top of the leaf versus the bottom of the leaf. So if that's pretty similar, as we see here, this is kind of a medium green tone on both the top and the bottom. That helps to push us towards black willow. Black willow is going to have the same medium green coloration on both top and bottom surfaces of the leaf. It'll have a leaf that again is fairly, most willows are fairly long leaves, of course. The leaves are fairly long compared to their width, but we also do sometimes try to measure the length and the width, and then look at the length to width ratio and see how much longer a leaf is than it is wide. That helps with sandbar willow, which is the next one we'll take a look at. But most likely, again, looking at this one, because of the coloration pattern and because of the length to width ratio here on these leaves, the amount of teeth that we see on the edge of this leaf, quite a few teeth. There's probably at least 15 teeth or so per linear inch there. This is probably Salix nigra, black willow. This would be a young plants right here. Black willow grows into a tree, can be a very, very large tree. But these would be young sapling size trees right now. The other one that is common, and you'll certainly come across in wetland areas, is this one right here. And you can see here, just looking at the leaves, that this one has much longer leaves compared to the width. So the length to width ratio on this one is much larger, probably up to maybe almost 20 times, 15 to 20 times longer than it is wide. This one too has pretty much the same sort of medium green coloration on both the bottom and the top, but because it's much more narrow, much longer, again, that length to width ratio is much larger. And now when we look at the number of teeth in about 1 inch of margin or so, there's very few teeth. There's probably about 5 or 6, maybe 7 teeth, little small teeth along the margin at least. So the teeth are very sparse and separated on this leaf compared to this leaf. This is sandbar willow, Salix interior or Salix exigua, a couple of the scientific names for it. This one is a shrub species. It can grow into a small tree, but we most often see it as forming these dense shrub thickets on sandbars, along streams, along riparian areas. Sandbar willow. All right, and then the last one we'll take a look at here along the margin here of the wetland is this one right here, just because it's here. This is a native species. This is blue flag in the iris family, and they can be told vegetatively. Kind of hate to break too much of this off, but we can just take a little piece of it here. The irises have what are called equitant leaves. Equitant means, it's a term that describes the situation we see here with the edges of the leaves are basically, coming together down here face to face like this. What's actually happening here is that the leaf is folded over in a sense, and we can't really separate it, but the leaf is would normally be like this has folded over and has fused along here. So when we look at the leaf on either side, we're actually looking at the bottom of the leaf. Again, the leaf was like this, and then it folds over and fuses. So you're looking at the bottom side of the leaf. And because of that, again, these leaves, as I was showing, come together edge to edge like that. That's a real good characteristic vegetatively for the blue flag. Helps you to separate it from other plants like sparganium, burrweed, or cattails, or other plants that have a similar looking large, sword-shaped leaf. And then lastly, we'll go back and take a look at the plants out here in the wetland, the submergent and floating leaf plants. I'll venture into the muck here a little ways. So you can certainly see all of the really large leafy stuff right here. This plant here. This is a potamogeton, or a pondweed. The potamogetons are usually fairly difficult. It helps a lot to have these flowering structures. They're difficult in part because they'll have both floating leaves like this one and submersed leaves. Sometimes you have to look at the submersed leaves to separate them. This one is probably, just looking at its general appearance, it looks like it's Potamogeton nodosus. And then, of course, there's a lot of little floating duckweed, tiny little plants here. These are in the group of plants that are the smallest of the flowering plants. That's little duckweed on the tip of my finger right there. That little tiny plant can produce a flower, a tiny flower. But duckweeds aren't the smallest. There's another plant called wolffia, or watermeal, that's even smaller than this and produces flowers, again, of course, that are smaller. Then out there a little bit further, we can see some of that light green material there. That's some type of filamentous algae. So the wetland basin here, probably constructed to help catch nutrients before they make their way down into the lake. Looks like it's probably doing a good job of that. Let's take a look at some non-native grasses that are often problematic in prairie plantings. First one, and probably the most common one, and probably often one of the most difficult ones to deal with, is smooth brome, Bromus inermis. That's this plant right here. Again, this is at the end of July, and so we're seeing these are non-native cool season grasses, and so they're pretty much done flowering and they're starting to die back. But here we can see some good examples. Brome will have pretty large spikelets where the flowers are. But probably the most distinguishing characteristic, of course, for the bromes is vegetatively. When you look at the leaves, remember that a leaf in a grass is attached at a node. This is a node right here. The first part of that leaf forms a sheath that wraps around the stem, and then at the top of the sheath, right up here, there's this, again, this collar structure. It's the division between the sheath and the blade, the photosynthetic blade. In brome, this sheath is fused so that it forms a solid piece of tissue, a hollow but solid piece of tissue that, again, wraps around the stem. That's something that you can see with a hand lens. Sometimes you can see it, if you look real close. What you'll see here as I pull this back is the sheath is split, forms kind of a V structure, but then at the bottom of that V, that tissue is completely fused. Other grasses that have what are called open sheath, this is called a closed sheath. An open sheath will have a sheath that the sheath overlaps like this, so the edges are not fused together. In brome, they're fused together like this. Those edges are fused together. In an open sheath, they're not fused, they overlap like this. So when you pull the sheath apart, an open sheath easily separates without any tearing of any tissue. A closed sheath, like brome has, when you pull down on it, you can force it to come apart, but you'll be tearing it. So that closed sheath is a really important characteristic for any of the bromes. Vegetatively, if you see it has a closed sheath, and you're in a upland environment, non-wet type of environment, pretty good chance you're looking at a brome. The only other species of grass that has a closed sheath that you probably encounter in Iowa is Glyceria, which is more of a wet soil grass. So the closed sheath, the ligule is a small little membrane. Now we can't see the leaves very well here. Maybe I can find a decent leaf here. Sometimes on brome, you can kind of see it right here. Get it in the light right here. There's sort of either an M or a W crinkled. It's kind of hard to see unless you're looking at it right in the light, but that M or W, depending upon which way you're holding it, is another kind of good characteristic that some people like to use to help distinguish smooth brome. It's not always present on all the leaves though. That closed sheath is better. And of course, just becoming familiar with the large spikelets that form the flowers, where the flowers are. Brome is a really common species, forage grass. It's widespread. Almost every prairie, every reconstruction, probably has a problem with smooth brome, unless the reconstruction went into an ag field, an old cornfield or bean field. So getting rid of and controlling smooth brome is always a problem that prairie managers have. A couple other grasses here just real quick. These are native grasses. Here's switchgrass. Switchgrass vegetatively, which is a native species, of course. If Pat can zoom in here get this in the light right, you see this dense patch of hairs at the base of the blade. Looking at the blade here again and coming down towards the bottom of the blade again, right above the collar, there's a dense patch of white little hairs there. That's a really good characteristic for switchgrass. And sort of like reed canary grass, again, that collar on switchgrass is a very distinctive, light color there. The collar area again between the blade and the sheath. Switchgrass has tiny little spikelets that have just a single flower in them, and they'll always have a very large branching type of structure up here, again with these tiny little spikelets. These are the spikelets right here, these little bead-like or round things that have a single flower in them. Here's actually some flowers right here. You can see the stigmas, the feathery stigmas, and the stamens are both protruding from those flowers right there. Proof that grasses do have flowers. Then the other one right over here, of course, this is big blue stem. Vegetatively, when we look at big blue stem, at this stage, it does have a lot of bluish, glaucous kind of coloration often on the stem, especially around the nodes. Here again is a node where a leaf is attached. You can kind of wipe that off. That term here is glaucous, for that kind of bluish, white, waxy covering that I've just wiped off there. Here's another one right here at this node. Undoubtedly, this is how it gets its name. And then the ligule, to separate big blue stem from Indian grass, we look at the ligule, which again is this membranous structure right here at the base of the blade at the top of the sheath. Here again, this is a sheath. This is an open sheath. And then the ligule is this membranous structure right here. In big blue stem, that ligule is nothing very significant. It's somewhat inconspicuous. It's there if you look for it. In Indian grass, if we find some Indian grass, we'll look at that. The ligule is much more conspicuous, several times taller than what we see there, and more stiff. Big blue stem. All right, now we're going to move across the trail here to look at a couple other non-native species. The first one I'll pick on is this one right here. This one's pretty easy to identify when it's in flower, because it has this really just dense, thick, crowded mass massive inflorescence here of tiny little spikelets. There's lots of spikelets in here. Remember that grass flowers are always arranged in these little tiny inflorescences called spikelets. This is a large group of those spikelets. There's a whole bunch of spikelets crowded together in here, and that's what forms this sort of thick, massive column right here. So Timothy is characterized by that. Then sometimes, I'll see if I can pull up enough of it here to show you, sometimes vegetatively, I'm not sure I can get enough of it up. Yeah, I did. You have to kind of pull up the whole stem, but look at the base of this stem here. You see a little large, or not large, but very clearly an enlarged little bulb-like structure right here. Timothy always has these little bulb-like structures at the base of the stems. Sometimes you can just kind of reach down in there and dig into the ground a little bit and feel that round little bulb. It's a bulb-like structure, at least. So that's Timothy, Phleum pratense. Phleum pratense is another pretty common forage grass introduced for pasture and hay. It doesn't really become too aggressive, though. I don't see large populations of it generally, but it is a cool season grass, and so has that same problem that other cool season grasses have in terms of competing with their native species. And then here's another one right here. This one is a little bit more aggressive and can be more of a problem species. And probably the best way again to recognize this one is when it is in flower and has its spikelets here. This is a quack grass. Now it's used to be Agropyron repens. Now it is Elamus repens, moved to a new genus. So quackgrass has these inflorescences that are pretty distinctive. These spikelets here, here's a spikelet, here's a spikelet. You can see the spikelets are arranged on opposite sides of the stem, kind of slight distance apart, a few millimeters apart. It forms this pretty distinctive flowering structure. Each of these spikelets here again has several flowers in it. Quackgrass is very stoloniferous and rhizomatous and will form sort of a clone, become somewhat of a problem because of that. And another thing on quackgrass vegetatively, again we're seeing it at the end of its its peak, so the leaves are kind of dying back, but this will be kind of hard to see with the camera, but right here again where the blade comes down and meets the sheath, right in the collar area, in that collar area, at the bottom of the blade are two little auricles, is what the term is. They're little slender projections that come off the base of the leaf, and I kind of, if this is the stem of the plant, the blade comes down, these little auricles kind of wrap around and project on the other side of the stem. They're very easy to see with a hand lens, but quackgrass leaves will always have those little auricles that project off the bottom of the blade and kind of wrap around on the opposite side of the stem. Quackgrass. Well, I'd like to show you a couple species that are native and often used and found, of course, in native prairies. They're supposed to be in native prairies, but I would caution people about probably planting these species, or at least, if you are going to include them in a seed mix, make sure that the seed rate is really low. You don't need very many of these, because both of these species we're going to talk about here are somewhat aggressive and become a real problem in prairies. The first one is cup plant, Silphium perfoliatum. So it's related to compass plant, it's related to rosinweed, the same genus, has very similar flowers, of course. It is a species we tend to find in but damper soils, so in swales or low-lying areas of prairies. It's a very large, robust plant, as you can see here, and you've probably seen in your own prairies. It has a very large, thick, somewhat square stem. The characteristic, of course, is that the leaves are fused together at the base. So you have opposite leaves here that are attached at a node, but these bases of these leaves are completely fused to each other so that it forms one massive, leaf structure here. The stem seems to perfoliate or go through the leaf. Basically it does. That's the source of its name. So it's an easy plant, of course, to recognize with these large cups, but it is a really difficult species to start controlling when you get too much of it. Probably one strategy, we can talk about some more of this, I guess, during the webinar, but this and sawtooth sunflower, which is this one right here, again, you're going to have a strategy that, of course, sort of selectively targets these species as much as possible. Because usually when you have this problem, you've got a prairie planting, and you've got lots of other good prairie species that you want. You have to try to at least reduce the amount of these. The other one, as I mentioned, is sawtooth sunflower. That's this plant right here. It's a pretty easy one to recognize. Got a couple of good stems here. So the leaves are generally opposite, like in most sunflowers. There will be some teeth, not necessarily very large, but the thing that really stands out on sawtooth sunflower is the stem, again, that's glabrous. It doesn't have any hairs on it, and it has this glaucous, bluish-white, waxy covering on the stem that, again, when you use your fingers, you can wipe that off. It will have substantial size to it. It can get pretty tall, about just as tall as the cup plant here, and can form dense clones. Again, most sunflowers have root rhizomes that they grow below ground that allows them to reproduce vegetatively, and you start getting these dense patches. So again, you don't want very much of this. It can overtake a prairie and reduce the diversity because it just gets too dense. We'll talk more about how to control these during the webinar. All right, we're standing along this boat launch to Ada Hayden Lake right here. We're kind of in a disturbed area here where this gravel meets in with vegetation over here. So we're just kind of going to walk along this edge and point out, the various weedy things that we're seeing here. Now let's start with plantain. Now, plantains are obviously something you're probably familiar with. This is a plantago down here. There is a couple of non-native species. This one here is Plantago major. It's non-native, weedy species. Most of the plantains are kind of weedy in general, even the native species. But this one looks most like a native species called Rugel's plantain. And the way to tell Rugel's plantain, which is the native one, from common plantain, which is a non-native one, is to look at the base of the plant down here, the base of these leaves, and you don't see any red coloration in through here at all. Rugel's plantain, the native version of this, will have dark red coloration, at least along the bottom parts of these petioles of these basal leaves. There'll be at least a half centimeter or so of red coloration down and through here. Very distinctive, very easy to see that. You don't need to have the flowers, you just need to be able to see the leaves. So for what it's worth, again, Rugel's plantain native, common plantain not. All right, then another one that we have right here in flower. This is flower of an hour, or Hibiscus trinonum. It's in the mallow family. Beautiful flower there. The leaves are a little bit eaten up, I think, by some Japanese beetles we've been seeing here, but here's a look at the leaves are somewhat divided into leaflets, it looks like here. Here's a leaflet here, and here's a leaflet, and the leaflets themselves are lobed. Usually there's at least 3 of them, so we're missing a leaflet on this side. Hibiscus trinonum, or flower of an hour, right here. Another common, we've mentioned this I think last month, but here's common ragweed, Ambrosia artemisifolia. Here's some sweet clover right here. So we're seeing again, pretty much everything we see down through here is going to be a weedy species. Can't tell which species, of course, but sweet clover, Mellotus. This plant right here, that's kind of spread out right here, has this thicker stem, kind of prostrate. Here's some of the leaves right here. This is common purslane. It's actually a species that has can photosynthesis, has the same photosynthetic pathway as cactus. So this one will really handle the heat and dryness pretty well. All right, here is a little weedy species, a native species though, we haven't seen yet. This is called Virginia copperleaf. Virginia copperleaf, Acalypha virginica. So there's a couple of species that look like this. This is Virginia copperleaf, and then there's another species, Acalypha rhambodia. The difference between those two species usually is just to look at the leaves here and the relative length of the petiole. When the petiole, this portion right here, relatively speaking, is less than the length of it is less than the length of the blade. The blade is, of course, all of this right here. That's all of the blade. You're looking at virginica. If the petiole was much longer relative to the blade, that would be rhambodia. Rhambodia is more of a floodplain forest species, where virginica is a little bit more of a weedy ruderal species. All right, then let's see. Here's one that you've probably seen, in farm fields. So this is velvet leaf, or otherwise also known as buttonweed, Abutilon theophrasti. It's in the mallow family as well, the same family as the flower of an hour. Pretty distinctive, there's heart-shaped, soft leaves on buttonweed or velvet leaf. All right, then let's see. Here's a common giant ragweed, not common, giant ragweed. We saw that earlier. Some more sweet clover here. Here is one that we've seen before as well. This is prickly lettuce, Lactuca cereola. Again, this one has very divided leaves. It has prickles, or these sharp little hair structures. You can kind of see them on the stem through here. Usually has some of those prickles on the bottom of the midrib. Here you can see them really well right there, I think. Right through here. If I hold that in the light just right. Those prickles. Usually some prickles along the margins of the leaves. And the leaves, again, they kind of come off and then they kind of turn, so that rather than being like this, they tend to be more like that. You see how that's occurring here. The leaves are kind of turning and oriented so that the edges of the leaves are up and down. Prickly lettuce, Lactuca cereola. Then let's see, here's some yellow foxtail right here. We haven't seen any foxtails yet. So Soteria is the genus. Yellow foxtail this is a really good example of it. It has this reddish coloration at the base of the tillers, of the stems. Has somewhat flattened stem. See how flat this looks here? Compressed, so to speak. And we look at the leaves at the base of the blade again. This is the sheath. This is the blade. Right here at the base of the blade, at the top of the sheath, a lot of kind of long, straggly looking hairs, usually present right through there. The ligule on the foxtails in this structure that's right at the junction of the sheath and the blade is a short little fringe of hairs. So ligules can be either a membrane structure or they can be a little row of hair-like structures. Alright, so yellow foxtail, Soteria glauca is the scientific name for that one. Alright, moving up the slope, here's some crown vetch. We've talked about crown vetch already. Here's some small plants in through here. That's some sweet clover. This is the crown vetch right here with the large number of leaflets on each leaf. Dandelion right here. And here's some Canada thistle. This one, there's one up further up here that has a little bit better flower head on it right here. So these are some flowers starting to form here. Cirsium arvensi, Canada thistle. This is a real difficult species often to control and invasive, certainly. And I think there's a couple more. Here's Canada thistle right here. Let's take a look at the bottom side of it, and we see that it's slightly a little bit lighter, but it's still kind of a light medium green. When we look at this thistle, we can see that the bottom side is way lighter. This has got all kinds of short little dense hairs forming that white surface on the bottom side of the leaf. Canada thistle doesn't have that at all. It can have a few hairs, but they're not dense enough and thick enough and carpet-like to the extent that we see here. So this is a native thistle. Again, the whiteness on the bottom side tells us it's a native thistle. This is Cirsium discolor, field thistle. So a good thistle to have. Yeah, I think we have one more to look at right here. This is giant foxtail. Right here, Soteria faberi. So the foxtail hairs are pretty distinctive. You often can recognize foxtails just again by just the dense mass of spikelets in here, and then all of those little bristles that are coming off intermixed with those spikelets. Those are little bristles that are mixed in with the spikelets there. Gives it that bristly look, hence the name foxtail. Another thing, if you don't have the heads, one thing about foxtails, especially giant foxtail and green foxtail, now yellow foxtail doesn't have this, but if you pull the sheath back, so you can see the sheath right here. Here again is the blade, here's the sheath. And then you'll need a hand lens probably to see this, but if you look at the margins of this sheath along the edges, remember this is an open sheath, so when I pulled the sheath back, what happened is the sheath just opened up. Now I'm looking along these margins of the sheath. If you look along those margins, there'll be a row of little tiny hairs. It'll be kind of hard to see probably with the camera, but I can see them with the hand lens. A row of just along the edge of that sheath margin, there's a row of tiny hairs. The foxtails have that, so they have those hairs along the margin of the sheath. That will be true for giant foxtail and for green foxtail. Then to separate giant and green, what I always do is just look at the surface of these leaves. Hold it up to the light, you can kind of see the surface of these leaves. Maybe you can see that on the camera, but there's hairs on the surface of the leaf. Pretty dense layer of hairs on the surface of the leaf. Those hairs tell you that it's giant foxtail. Green foxtail would be glabrous. The surface of the leaf would be without any hairs at all. And usually on green foxtail, the flowering head isn't quite so large, and it doesn't usually droop as much as giant foxtail. Green foxtail, usually it's a little bit shorter and it usually stands up more. Green foxtail, giant foxtail, yellow foxtail. These are all non-native warm season grasses and annual grasses that because again they're warm season grasses, they're flowering now towards the end of summer during the warm season, the warm part of the summer. But they're annual grasses, so once the perennial prairie grasses get established, you can have a lot of these, of course, and be somewhat of a problem in the early stages of a prairie planting. But as the perennial warm season grasses get established, start competing and start shading out these grasses, then these weedy foxtail species will usually fade away. Here we are along a margin of a large wetland area. We're looking at some cattails here. So I wanted to point out, the cattails in Iowa, talk about them quickly. So there's two species of native cattail, at least we believe two, native to Iowa. The broadleaf is certainly native to Iowa and North America. This one is the narrowleaf cattail. You can see again the leaves are really narrow. I don't have a broadleaf one here, but the broadleaf cattail will have leaves that are probably at least 2.5 times larger or wider than what these are here. And the flowering heads on narrowleaf cattail are much different from the broadleaf cattail as well. For one thing, the female part of the inflorescence down here, these are all female flowers. Then the male flowers, which are gone now because the pollen has already been dispersed, but the male flowers were up here. You can see a green band right here. This did not have any flowers. The male flowers started right here, and they were in this area right here. So the fact that there's a separation between where the male flowers and the bottom of the male flowers, then there's this green separation without any flowers. And then at the top of the female flowers right here, that separation is another good characteristic of narrowleaf. So narrowleaf is probably best described as a cryptic species because it's not completely certain what its native origin is. Some recent work has suggested, genetic work has suggested that it is probably native to North America, and Flora of Iowa Committee or Flora of Iowa Working Group has looked at the information, looked at the research, and we've decided to probably consider, it's probably best to consider it native to Iowa as well. But it's not completely clear. Now there is a hybrid species, Typha glauca, which is a hybrid between the narrowleaf, this species, and the broadleaf. The hybrid, like most hybrids, usually exhibits more vigor, a little bit more tendency to become a weedy, aggressive species. I would say that Angustifolia, the narrowleaf, and Latifolia, the broadleaf, when they're pure, those lines aren't too bad, but the hybrid can be more of a problem. The hybrid's going to exhibit just an intermediate level of characteristics, so the leaves will be intermediate between the really narrow leaves of Angustifolia and the broader leaves of Latifolia. The flowering spikes and heads will be a little bit thicker. There'll be less separation here. So it just basically exhibits just a blending of the characteristics and an intermediate stage between the two. And it also usually grows much taller and is more robust. Let's take a look at some woody species, non-native, somewhat invasive woody species, and this one right here would be a tree that's certainly at the top of my list. I've seen many places that have a problem with Siberian elm, Ulmus pumila is the scientific name. This is it right here in shrub or sapling size form. It will again grow, of course, into a very large tree. So it has the typical elm leaves, as you can kind of see here, with the very strong pinnate venation, but the leaves are way much smaller than the leaves of American elm or red elm. Now it can be a little bit more difficult when you're looking at a full-size tree and you're looking at sun leaves and shade leaves, but in general, again, if you're overall look at all the leaves in general, and if the elm leaves are considerably smaller than I would say probably in the 2 to 2.5 inch length size range. If leaves are not much bigger than 2.5 inches or so long, then Siberian elm is probably what you've got. Both American elm and red elm leaves are usually 3 to 4 inches long. Siberian elm. Right next to it here, just for fun, let's take a look at some blooming prairie plants. Here's some butterfly milkweed still hanging on. There's some nice blooms there. So butterfly milkweed is quite different from the other milkweeds, of course, in that the leaves are alternate. Just to get a piece of this branch off. The leaves are alternate rather than opposite, like most milkweeds. The leaves are pretty crowded along the stem. There's lots of leaves here, and it doesn't have any milky sap. So butterfly milkweed kind of stands out as kind of unique among the milkweeds in that regard. But I would say it's probably one of the most striking and most beautiful of the milkweeds when it's in flower. And another one that's flowering here in this prairie planting is this ironweed back here. This is Vernonia. Looks like it is Vernonia baldwinii, Baldwin's ironweed, which is the most common of the 4 species of ironweed that we have in Iowa. So it has flowers that are kind of similar to the flowers in a blazing star, in that when we look at the head of flowers here, these are all disc flowers. So again, if you go back to think about Asteraceae, which is what this plant is in, the family it's in, Asteraceae can have ray flowers, can have disc flowers, or can have both ray and disc flowers, which is what you see when you look at a sunflower, for example. But when you're looking at a blazing star or an ironweed, you're looking at just disc flowers. So the way to separate some of these ironweeds is some of the leaf characteristics, whether there's hairs or not, the type of solid tooth, so the type of teeth along the margins of the leaves, the size of those teeth, and then often also some flower characteristics are used for separating, for example, Vernonia mazurica and Vernonia gigantea from this species here, Vernonia baldwinii. Let's take a look at another tree here we found along the trail, a honey locust. So honey locust is a native species, of course. It really was probably most predominant on floodplain environments, but now it's become really quite invasive, especially in pastures. It can be pretty much of a problem in reconstructed prairies. So it's a species we often have to control. Honey locust usually has very large thorns. This species, this specimen right here, it doesn't have any thorns anywhere, so either it hasn't developed them yet, if it's a young plant, or it's possible it's a thornless variety which has been developed horticulturally to provide shade. The leaves on honey locust are either once or twice compound. So you pull off a leaf, let me just check just to be sure. Yeah, so when you're trying to decide where a leaf begins and where a leaf ends, what we would like to look for is the axil of the leaf and look for a bud. In honey locust, the buds are somewhat concealed, so it's a little bit hard to find them, but there's a bud right down in here. That means that then all of this is a leaf. And since we've got leaflets that are arranged on an axis that is coming off the main axis, this is twice compound. So this is the primary rachis right here, and then the secondary rachis comes off of it, and that's where the leaflets are attached. So this is twice compound. Honey locusts are either once or twice compound. Usually you'll see both once and twice compound leaves on the same tree, same plant. Lots of small leaflets, as you see here. But of course, the characteristic that you always like to use to confirm it are the large thorns. The thorns on honey locusts are modified branches. That means that they're going to come off of the plant, again, in the location of where a bud would be. A bud is what produces the lateral growth, produces branches that then produce more leaves. And in the honey locust, again, that branch becomes modified into a sharp, strong, pointy thing we call a thorn. So in honey locusts, the thorns are modified branches. Sharp, pointy things on other plants are other kinds of modifications. So for example, if you look at a raspberry plant, the sharp, pointy little things there, they're not nearly as big as a thorn, of course, but they're sharp and they're pointy. They're made to protect the plant, of course. Those are modified hairs. And then on black locust, for example, a relative of this in the same family, the sharp, pointy things there are called spines because those are modified leaves. Point being, again, is that structures made to protect the plant can either be modified branches, a thorn, modified leaves, a spine, or modified hairs, a prickle.